Hey dudes, welcome back to another video. Today I'm discussing how Blizzard could improve Feral Druid in Mythic Plus purely from a DPS standpoint, and I'm kind of justifying why I think Feral needs this and what I personally would change in order to make this happen. It's something that I think is quite easy to do and would just kind of be like, you know, not necessarily a percent damage increase, but just messing with the knobs that we already have, right? It's not adding a new feature, it's not adding a new spell, changing a talent, anything that normally would occur on, say, a 9.0.5 patch or a 9.1, you know, a bigger patch that's going to be coming way down the line. This is something that could happen, you know, on a reset, and something that I think is quite critical right now for Feral Druid to kind of get the playtime that it needs in Mythic Plus, especially from someone like myself who's doing this a lot, playing a lot of Feral Mythic Plus. I want to see these changes coming through so that I can just not feel bad about playing. It's not even necessarily about being one of the best specs and getting invited to keys. It's like when you're in a key or playing with friends, you just don't want to be the letdown of the group. And I mean, I'll show you some examples here in a second of where I feel that way, but hopefully Blizzard might be interested in listening to some of these changes. And for anyone that can't be bothered to read through it, I thought I'd make a quick video just to discuss and detail some of these thoughts that I've been having. So getting into it, I made a tweet last night, on the 17th of or 18th of February, and I just kind of said my thoughts on how to improve Feral DPS in Mythic Plus without impacting raid or PvP. This is something that I'm quite stern with. I don't want these changes to impact raid or PvP, so I don't want this to affect areas of our spells or our toolkit that would affect raid or PvP, because we're performing quite well right now in those areas, and Blizzard could just throw the whole thing out the window because they go, oh, well, any change to here or here would just impact raid. No, we don't want to do it. We like how raid is right now. You know, I don't know their thoughts, but I just think if I can keep it strictly to Mythic Plus and what would help us in this larger AoE setting, then maybe they'll be more willing to listen. And like I say, it's something that doesn't need to make sure everything's balanced and lying across multiple facets of the game. So this is my thinking. Again, this is going to focus mainly on just DPS rather than like, oh, give us innovate and trends and all that kind of stuff, because that, I think, again, is something that could potentially take more time to implement and something that might be you know, they might have thoughts on how they might want to do that in a later patch. This is just strictly a DPS issue. I did follow up this original post. So I'll show you the document in a moment, but I did follow up this original post by saying, to add to this as well, currently in Mythic Plus, Feral CDs are so useless people won't even coordinate cooldowns with you. You sit on Discord listening to the mage and hunter discuss who should go big where, kind of like being the younger sibling whose controller isn't plugged in. And that is exactly how it feels in keys. I mean, I've done keys with multiple people on Discord, and, you know, I've played, you know, for anyone that's checked out my Twitch channel, twitch.tv/Psybearslat, I've been online and I've been playing with like Shella, the big warlock, and people like Cryptex and stuff like that, and we're just kind of talking, and we're like, all right, you know, who's got cooldowns for the next pack? And like it started off with, they'd be like, oh, side, do you have cooldowns? And I'd be like, oh, you know, like, you know, yeah, no, whatever. And then eventually after a few keys, like, they just stop asking if you have cooldowns, because your cooldowns are so unimpactful that it doesn't really matter. Like, Berserk and Convoke just don't quite do what a mage can do, and they don't quite do what a hunter can do, and what a windwalker can do, and a boomkin, and a survival hunter, and like potentially even things like Ret Paladin and Warriors. You just can't quite do what these specs are able to do. And I mean, maybe this is a topic for another video, but I think burst DPS right now is king, and that's why I think Feral could kind of have some changes to help us in this area. But getting into it, so in this document, I've kind of said not intended to address all Feral's issues, mainly focusing on Mythic Plus. So I kind of discuss how Feral's doing well in Raid, it's doing well in PvP. I'm saying that we're struggling in Mythic Plus specifically because we have good sustained damage, but our burst is struggling and we're unable to compete with some of these other specs in the game, like Fire Mage and things like that. Additionally, I was saying that Convoke, whilst it's a very strong cooldown in say, single target, if you look at a fight like Sludge Fist in Castle Nathria, Convoke is a great spell there because it's pure single target. It's doing a bunch of shreds and ferocious bites and moonfires, which are working well with your draft of deep focus, and it's really, really good there. Or in PvP, in arena, when you can bash someone or maim them for 4 seconds, and you get this massive Convoke window where you're just uninterrupted and you can lock somebody down and you can potentially kill somebody in that 4-second window and win the big game. So that's really, really great. But when you add targets to Convoke, suddenly it becomes less useful. Instead of doing these big ferocious bites, these big shreds that are really good in this single target scenario, in AoE, you're doing things like Wrath and Moonfire and like Rake Spreading, which is nice to have additional Moonfires and Rakes and stuff, but they're not exactly massive AoE. Like, if you compare that to a full moon is a massive damage increase, or Starfall, where you're doing massive uncapped AoE, and then you compare that to, say, like a Feral Frenzy, which it doesn't matter if you're on 1 target or 10 targets, Feral Frenzy is going to do the same damage, you know? So Convoke is actually, I would say, worse in AoE. Like, I can burst 30k DPS on single target with my Berserker, my Convoke, and Prideful, but if I go on AoE 5 targets, I'll only burst like, you know, 15k or so, because the spell algorithm changes, right? So it's just not as good. Now, I then go on to say why I think Feral needs a buff to its AoE potential. So right now, this is the main thing that I want to highlight. When playing Circle of Life and Death and Blood Talons, currently the best in slot Mythic Plus playstyle for overall throughput, right? We know that. The result is that you want to rake spread on as many targets as possible, which means that on a 2-target fight, you want to rake both targets, you want to make sure they have Thrash, and that they're suffering from Primal Wrath rips, right? And then you swipe with any additional, you know, to generate additional combo points and anything like that, because you've got everything bled up, so then you just swipe as a remainder. However, on 5 or more targets, you're actually unable to endlessly rake, because you hit a point of not having enough energy, right? That's your limiting factor, is not enough energy. So you actually never reach a point where every target is raked up, and you can sufficiently swipe without janking your Blood Talons window. Not consistently anyway. Definitely not on something, say, like 10 targets, mass AoE, right? You're definitely not going to hit rake, like a rake threshold where everything is raked up. So you would never swipe at any point. And because of this target cap of 5 targets, it means that raking on 5 targets is as good as raking on 20 targets, because swipe is only ever going to hit 5 anyway. So it becomes a point where in like 2 targets you would swipe. However, in 10 targets you stop swiping because you would just rake spread. So this like AoE cap is really kind of hit swipe in a strange way. And for me, this is the area where Feral's struggling, right? Like, our bleeds are doing good damage in Mythic Plus, and if you were to increase our rip damage or our rake damage or anything like that, shred damage, all of these things would impact us in raid, which I think would be a negative, or would be received negatively, and Blizzard may not go for it. Now, on top of that, we've lost Wild Flesh Rending, and also a bunch of other specs that were underperforming, say like Warrior and Survival Hunter and all these things. They got a flat % buff to a lot of these specs, that now, instead of Feral being like kind of middle of the pack, and then there were like these extreme outliers up at the top, like Fire Mage and all that stuff, it's now like Feral's like kind of stayed here, but like a bunch of other stuff's now like moved up beyond it. And now these things are closer to these outliers, but Feral's kind of stayed here. So now I feel like there's this disparity where Feral's kind of now been left behind because Blizzard buffed these other specs. And this is where I think just these flat damage increases aren't good buffs. And instead of trying to buff 18 other specs, why don't you just nerf the 3 top specs? And then it's much easier, because now otherwise you have to bring everything up, right? But regardless, I then go on to say my suggestions, finally. So my suggestions for this are removing the AoE cap on all Feral abilities, which would be Swipe and Brutal Slash, which would be really nice, but I don't expect them to do that. So, okay, we'll move on to more realistic options. I don't want to see a flat damage buff. This is disruptive to raid and PvP balancing, so I don't want to just see a flat damage buff, because that won't necessarily address the core issue of Feral Druid, which is lack of AoE burst damage and lack of AoE burst damage, basically. Buff swipe damage, or uncap swipe to 8 targets instead of 5. Then at least you'll reach a point where rake spreading stops being the best option, and swipe actually does sufficient damage to be worth using on enough targets, which would help us in these mass AoE pulls, right? Then this other one, which I don't really love, would be during Berserk, swipe damage is increased by 60% to reflect the shred and rake damage increase. I don't love that one, but it's something where at least, like, you know, in AoE you have an AoE ability to use during your Berserk window. Also, I mentioned buffing rake damage when applied to multiple targets. So say you were to rake, once rake was applied to 3 or more targets, the damage was increased or whatever. If there was something in that, that means, again, it wouldn't affect raid, it wouldn't affect PvP, but it would affect larger pulls. Or make it so that during Berserk, rake is applied to 3 targets and not 1. I'm not super fond of that idea because then again, we're still multi-raking in AoE, and I want to see us doing, using our swipe if we're going to have it, or like thrash, just doing more damage, right? I'm not super fond of that one, but it would at least increase our damage, which would be nice, and would help us with our energy efficiency. The last one would be to add an AoE element or a reduced cooldown to Berserk. I think if Berserk was on a lower cooldown, and maybe it was every 2 minutes, so it lined up perfectly with Convoke every time, then that would maybe at least make it a little bit better. You'd have it more consistently. You'd be able to, just overall, because you have higher burst periods, or more consistent burst damage periods, you would overall end up higher up on the DPS meters, and you'd be able to deal with things like prides, or like that troublesome spirit in the other side, or just mobs that really need to die, things like a Hellion or the mini bosses or whatever in Spires of Ascension on the last boss. Various times where just being able to single target funnel would be really, really nice as well. That could in like overall increase our damage. A few last minute things I just wanted to mention as well is I put potential alternatives. Primal Wrath initial damage would be increased if they don't want to mess with swipe uncaps. So that would be good to still increase our damage on AoE. Or they could buff rip damage, which would also have the added benefit of making other specs cry because Feral would be so strong now. Other issues worth mentioning: Sunfire Weaving sucks, not because it's out of place, but because I need to be in cat form to kick or to maim. And if I'm using globals on Weaving, then I'm unable to help my team. So I don't like Sun Weaving for that aspect because it means that I'm then unable to kick. Balance Druid is kicking our ass, which I think is fair to say, and also let me battle res in cat form. But let me know what you think in the comments. I will link this document so you can read through it thoroughly if you would like to. But let me know your comments. Sorry, this video is a little bit long. Let me know your comments in the comment section below, or alternatively, at me on Twitter and respond to this tweet, because that will mean that it will hopefully get more attention from Blizz, and Ian and stuff might be more interested in taking a look if this gains a bit of traction. If you disagree with me, I want to hear it as well. If you think this is stupid and you'd want to see something else, go for it. I'm all open to criticism and ideas. I just want to open up this discussion of what Feral, or what could change for Feral to help us in Mythic Plus. But yeah, let me know. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next one. Remember to check out my channel, twitch.tv/Psybearslat, if you want to see me live and talk in person. Peace.